Some decisions happen between heartbeats, moments too small to measure but too large to undo. Alina Karsk learned this the night she opened her cellar door to a bleeding stranger. Mercy, once given, becomes a debt that follows you home. She had spent 26 years perfecting the art of being overlooked. The daughter of a border jailer, raised among iron keys and men who confused authority with cruelty. She knew the value of silence, the safety of shadows, how invisible people could move through the world without disturbing its sharp edges. Her father's house had taught her that some doors were meant to stay locked, that some conversations were better left unheard, that survival often looked like doing nothing at all. But on the night the hunted man collapsed against her kitchen door, trailing blood and the kind of desperation that makes animals dangerous, Alina found herself choosing action over safety. She saw exhaustion that mirrored her own, wounds that needed tending, and the particular stillness of someone who had learned to expect nothing from the world. She didn't ask his name. She didn't think about consequences. She simply cleaned his cuts, locked him in her father's old cellar, and went upstairs to wait for morning. What she couldn't know was that some acts of kindness are really acts of revolution. That the man bleeding in her cellar would return months later wearing the weight of command, like a sentence handed down without appeal. That the Alpha's mantle would transform him from grateful fugitive into something far more dangerous. Someone who remembered every debt, every favor, every moment of vulnerability that had shaped his path to power. In the borderlands where pack law meets human frailty, where authority is earned through violence and maintained through fear, Alina would learn that there is no such thing as neutral ground during a hunt, that helping the hunted means choosing a side, whether you meant to or not, that some choices, made in darkness and silence, cast shadows long enough to reshape everything that comes after. The cellar door still bears the scratches her fingernails made, searching for the keyhole in the dark, and in the spaces between what was meant to happen and what actually did, between the woman who thought she was saving a stranger and the Alpha who would never forget the taste of sanctuary, lies a story about the price of compassion and the weight of power remembered. Some doors, once opened, can never be truly closed again. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The lock on the cellar door had been painted over so many times that Alina had to force her fingernail under the edge to find the keyhole. Black paint, then green, then white, then something that might have been yellow once. Her father had painted things when he ran out of other ways to keep busy. The key turned with the sound metal makes when it's been ignored too long. A scraping that went on longer than it should have. She held the lantern higher. The steps went down at an angle that made her think whoever built them had been in a hurry. Wood that felt soft under her feet, like it might give way if she trusted it too much. The man was unconscious when she dragged him to the bottom step. Blood on the back of his shirt. More blood on his left shoulder, where something had torn through cloth and kept going. He was heavier than he looked, the kind of weight that comes from muscle, not height. Alina wiped her hands on her apron. The fabric was already stained from washing dishes, so the blood didn't show much. She went back upstairs for water and clean rags. The kitchen window faced the road. No lights moving out there. No sounds except the wind pushing against the house in ways that made the walls creak. She filled a bowl from the pump, grabbed the bottle of spirits from under the sink. Her father used to clean wounds with it. Before that, he drank from it. When she got back to the cellar, the man had turned onto his side. His breathing was shallow but steady. She set the lantern on a wooden crate and knelt beside him. The wound on his shoulder wasn't as deep as she'd thought. The blood made it look worse. She poured spirits over the torn skin, and he made a sound like someone trying not to wake up. His eyes stayed closed. Alina worked without thinking about what she was doing. Clean the cut. Press cloth against it until the bleeding slowed. Wrap it tight enough to hold but not tight enough to cut off circulation. Things her father had taught her by making her watch while he patched up prisoners who'd been brought in damaged. Never ask what happened, he used to say. Just fix what's broken and lock the door. The man's hair was darker than it looked upstairs, brown with threads of gray that caught the lantern light. His face had lines around the eyes, the kind that come from squinting into weather. A scar across his chin that was old enough to be white. She finished with his shoulder and started on his back. 3 cuts there, parallel lines like claw marks, shallower than the shoulder wound but long. Something had raked across him while he was running. The cloth she was using turned red faster than she could clean it. She went upstairs for more rags, and when she came back down, his eyes were open. He didn't move, just looked at her with the expression people get when they wake up somewhere they don't remember going. Not afraid, exactly. Calculating. "You're in my cellar," she said. He tried to sit up and stopped halfway. A sharp breath that turned into something like a grunt. "Don't." Alina pressed her palm against his good shoulder. "You'll start bleeding again." He settled back down, but kept watching her face. His eyes were lighter than she'd expected. Gray or pale blue. Hard to tell in the lantern light. How long? His voice was rough, like he'd been running for hours without water. 2 hours. Maybe 3. He looked around the cellar. Wooden shelves lined with jars of preserved vegetables. A pile of burlap sacks in one corner. The brick walls that sweated in summer and froze in winter. Nothing that would tell him where he was, or why he was there. "They brought dogs," she said. He nodded once. Like that explained something he'd already figured out. Alina went back to cleaning the cuts on his back. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but the wounds needed to stay clean. Infection killed more men than blood loss, her father used to say, especially men who couldn't afford to see a doctor. "What's your name?" she asked. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Does it matter?" She supposed it didn't. When she finished with his back, she helped him sit up against the brick wall. He moved carefully, testing what hurt and how much. The kind of caution that comes from being injured before. "Water," he said. She brought him a cup from upstairs. He drank it slowly. Small sips that he held in his mouth before swallowing, like someone who'd learned not to trust his stomach when it was empty. "There's bread," she said. "And cheese." He shook his head. "Water's enough." Alina sat back on her heels. The cellar was cold enough that she could see her breath when she exhaled. Winter had come early this year, and it was staying later than usual. The kind of cold that got into your bones and made everything ache. "They'll be back in the morning," she said. "With fresh dogs." "I know. You can't run like this." He looked down at his shoulder, then at the bandages she'd wrapped around his back. "No," he said. "I can't." The lantern flame jumped when a draft came down the stairs. Shadows moved across the walls like something alive. Alina watched them dance and tried not to think about what would happen if someone found him here. "The door locks from the outside," she said. He nodded, like he'd already noticed that. "I'll bring you food in the morning, after they're gone." "Why?" The question caught her off guard. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she'd never tried to put it into words before. "My father used to say that some doors are meant to stay closed," she said finally, "and some are meant to be opened when no one's watching." He studied her face, like he was trying to decide whether to believe her, or maybe trying to decide whether it mattered if he believed her or not. "What if they don't leave?" he asked. Alina stood up and brushed dust off her skirt. "Then you'll find out what the cellar looks like when it's locked from the outside." She picked up the lantern and climbed the stairs. At the top, she turned back once. He was still sitting against the wall, watching her. In the dim light, he looked smaller than he had when she was kneeling beside him. More human. She closed the door and turned the key. The lock clicked into place with the same scraping sound as before. She put the key in her pocket and went to the kitchen to wash the blood off her hands. Outside, the wind was picking up. It rattled the windows and made the house feel smaller than it was. Alina made tea and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the sounds the old wood made when it settled. She thought about the man in her cellar, about the dogs that would come in the morning, about her father, who used to lock men up instead of letting them go. The tea went cold while she sat there. When she finally got up to go to bed, she left the cup on the table. She'd clean it in the morning, after the hunters moved on, after she unlocked the door, and found out whether the choice she'd made tonight was the kind that could be undone. The key in her pocket felt heavier than it should have, like it was made of something denser than metal. Upstairs, she lay in bed and listened to the house creak around her. Sometimes she thought she could hear sounds from the cellar, footsteps maybe, or someone shifting position. But the walls were thick, and the wind was loud, and she couldn't be sure. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about what morning would bring. The dogs arrived before dawn. Alina heard them first as a distant bang that could have been wind through trees, except the wind doesn't move in patterns. She was already dressed, had been since 4 a.m, sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee and a piece of bread she kept breaking into smaller pieces without eating. Through the window, She watched torches bob along the road like fallen stars. 5 men, maybe 6. Hard to count when they kept moving between the trees. The dogs pulled ahead of them, noses to the ground, following something only they could smell. Alina put the bread in her pocket and went outside to meet them. The lead hunter was a man named Keston, whose face looked like it had been carved with a dull knife, thick eyebrows that grew together over his nose, scars on both hands from training dogs that bit back. He'd been to her father's jail 3 times that she could remember, always chasing someone who'd run farther than expected. "Morning, Alina." He didn't dismount from his horse. The animal was breathing hard, white foam around the bit. "We're tracking a fugitive. Trail went cold about a mile back, but the dogs picked up something near your property line." "What kind of fugitive?" Keston spat into the dirt beside his horse. "The kind that kills alphas." One of the other hunters, a younger man with nervous hands, rode closer. "Rovan Thale. You know the name?" She didn't, but she shook her head anyway. Lies came easier when they were small. "Poisoned Alpha Garrett 3 days ago," the young hunter continued. "During a territorial negotiation, used something that made it look like a heart attack until the pack doctor cut him open." Keston shot the younger man a look that shut him up. "Point is, he's dangerous. And he's bleeding." Dogs tracked blood from the river crossing to somewhere around here. The dogs had spread out across her yard, sniffing at fence posts and the base of the apple tree. One of them, a black and tan hound with ribs showing through its coat, kept circling back to the area near the kitchen door. It would put its nose to the ground, follow something for a few steps, then lose the trail and start over. "You mind if we look around?" Keston asked, but he was already signaling to his men to dismount. Of course not. Alina led them around the house, pointing out the storm cellar, the root cellar, the old chicken coop her father had never torn down. The hunters poked through everything with the methodical boredom of men who'd searched 100 hiding places, and found them all empty. The black and tan hound kept returning to the kitchen door. It would scratch at the wood, whine once, then trot away when Keston whistled. But it always came back. "That dog's acting strange," the young hunter said. Keston looked at the hound, then at the kitchen door, then at Alina. "Mind if we check inside?" She opened the door and stood back. The hunters filed through her kitchen like they owned it, opening cabinets, looking under the sink, testing floorboards with the toes of their boots. One of them found the cellar door. "What's down there?" "Storage," Alina said. "Preserves, mostly. Root vegetables." The hunter tried the handle. "Locked." "Key?" Keston asked. Alina felt the weight of it in her pocket, warm against her leg. "I think my father lost it years ago. Haven't been down there since he died." It wasn't entirely a lie. She'd only been down there twice before last night. Keston studied the door for a long moment. The paint was chipped around the keyhole, and the wood was darker there, like it had been handled more than the rest. But old doors look like that sometimes. Especially doors that led to places people wanted to keep private. "Could break it down," one of the hunters suggested. "Could," Keston agreed. But he was looking at Alina's face now, not the door. Though if it's been locked for years, probably nothing down there but rats and mold. The black and tan hound scratched at the cellar door and whined. Keston whistled sharply, and the dog reluctantly moved away. They searched the rest of the house, checked under her bed, behind the dresser, inside the wardrobe that still smelled like her father's tobacco. Found nothing but dust, and the kind of emptiness that comes from living alone too long. When they finished, Keston gathered his men in the yard. The dogs had given up on whatever scent they'd been following. Now they were more interested in the smell of bacon fat from Alina's breakfast pan. "Trail goes cold here," Keston announced. Either he kept moving, or he found a way to mask his scent. "The river's not far," the young hunter said. "Could have doubled back, followed the water downstream." Keston nodded. "We'll try that next." He looked at Alina. "You see anything unusual last night? Hear anything?" "Wind kept me awake," she said. "Made the house creak. But that's normal for this time of year. Anyone comes around asking questions, you send word immediately. It wasn't a request. This man is dangerous. He's killed once and he'll kill again if he gets cornered." "I understand." The hunters mounted up and rode toward the river. Alina watched until their torches disappeared between the trees, then went back inside. The house felt different now that it had been searched, like someone had moved all the furniture half an inch in the wrong direction. She waited an hour before she unlocked the cellar door. Long enough for the hunters to get well clear of her property. Long enough for the dogs to lose her scent trail. The man was awake when she came down the stairs. sitting in the same position she'd left him, but his eyes were alert now, sharp. He'd heard the voices upstairs, the boots on the floorboards, the scratching at the door. "How many?" he asked. "6, with dogs. They find anything?" Alina set down the tray she'd brought. Bread, cheese, a jar of preserved apples, water in a clay pitcher. "One of the dogs knew you'd been here, kept coming back to the door." He was quiet for a moment, processing that, but they didn't break it down. No. Why not? She'd been asking herself the same question. Keston was thorough. He didn't leave hiding places unchecked, but something had made him walk away from that door. Maybe it was the rust on the hinges, or the way the paint had built up over the years. Maybe it was because breaking down doors took time, and the trail was getting colder with every hour they waited. Or maybe it was because Alina had been standing there looking nervous about something else entirely. And nervous people always had secrets that weren't worth breaking doors to discover. "I don't know," she said. He reached for the water pitcher and drank directly from it. His hands were steadier than they'd been the night before, but she could see the effort it took to lift his left arm. The shoulder wound was still fresh. "They said you killed an alpha." "They said a lot of things, I imagine." Alina sat on a wooden crate across from him. The cellar was warmer with 2 people in it, but still cold enough that her breath made small clouds when she spoke. "Did you?" He looked at her for a long time before answering, like he was trying to decide whether the truth was worth the risk of telling it. "Yes," he said finally. "Why?" "Because he needed killing." It wasn't the answer she'd expected. No justification, no explanation of circumstances or self-defense, just a simple statement of fact, delivered like he was commenting on the weather. "The hunters said it was poison, during a negotiation." It was. That's not exactly honorable combat. Honor is a luxury for people who aren't going to die either way. Alina broke off a piece of bread and handed it to him. He ate slowly, chewing each bite thoroughly before swallowing, like someone who'd learned that food wasn't guaranteed. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now they'll search every house, every barn, every cave within a day's ride of here. When they don't find me, they'll expand the search. Bring in more dogs, more hunters. Eventually, they'll decide I'm either dead or long gone. How long?" "A week, maybe 2. Alina looked around the cellar. It wasn't built for long-term habitation. No proper ventilation, no place to wash, barely enough room to lie down flat. And if someone really wanted to search it, all they had to do was break the door. "I can't keep you here for 2 weeks." "I know. Then what?" He finished the bread and reached for the cheese. Cut off a small piece with a knife she'd brought down earlier. "I'll figure something out." "Like what?" "I don't know yet." The honesty was unsettling. Alina had expected him to have a plan, some kind of strategy beyond hiding in her cellar until the search moved on. But he was just a man who'd made a choice, and was now dealing with the consequences one day at a time. "Tell me about the alpha you killed," she said. "Garrett." He spoke the name like it tasted bad. Been pack leader for 15 years. Had a territory that stretched from the river to the mountain pass. That's a lot of ground. It was. He paused, considering his next words. Garrett believed in expansion. Said the pack needed more hunting grounds. More tribute from the smaller settlements. Said it was the natural order for the strong to take what they needed from the weak. Alina thought about her father, about the men he'd locked up over the years. Most of them had been caught poaching or smuggling or failing to pay their taxes. But some had been guilty of nothing more than being in the wrong place when someone powerful needed someone to blame. "You disagreed?" "I thought there were enough graves already." The way he said it made her think he'd seen those graves personally, maybe helped dig some of them. "So you poisoned him." "I put oleander in his wine during a border negotiation." Made it look like his heart gave out from the stress of the meeting. He met her eyes. It was quick, cleaner than he deserved. Oleander. Alina knew the plant. Her father had warned her about it when she was young, told her never to burn the wood or let the livestock graze near it. Every part of the plant was toxic. Flowers, leaves, bark, even the honey made by bees that visited the blossoms. "Where did you learn about poison?" "My mother was a healer, before the pack took our land and made her a servant." His voice didn't change when he talked about his mother, but his hands stopped moving. "She taught me which plants could cure and which ones could kill. Said the difference was usually just a matter of quantity." "Is she still alive?" "No." The finality in that single word told Alina not to ask for details. Some stories weren't meant to be shared with strangers in cellars. What will happen to the pack now that Garrett's dead? They'll choose a new alpha. Probably someone worse. He drank more water, then set the pitcher down carefully. That's how these things usually work. The smart ones know better than to want the job. Then why kill him at all? Because sometimes the right choice isn't the smart choice. Alina understood that. Her father had made plenty of right choices that weren't smart, like taking in prisoners who couldn't pay their fines instead of turning them over to debt collectors, like letting her keep the house when she had no legal claim to it, like teaching her to read and write when most people thought education was wasted on daughters. The hunters will be back, she said. Probably. Next time they might not be so easily turned away. No, he agreed. They might not. They sat in silence for a while. The cellar was quiet except for the sound of their breathing and the occasional creak from the house above. Alina found herself studying his face in the lantern light. The scar on his chin was old, but there were newer marks too. A cut across his left cheekbone that was still healing, bruises around his neck that looked like finger marks. Someone tried to strangle you. He touched his neck reflexively. Garrett's bodyguard. After I poisoned his alpha. But you got away. I killed him too. How? Broke his windpipe with my elbow. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was describing how to repair a broken fence. He was bigger than me, but he was angry. Angry people make mistakes. Alina tried to imagine this man fighting for his life against someone bigger and stronger, tried to picture him desperate enough to kill with his bare hands. It was easier than she would have liked. Is that when you got the cuts on your back? No, those happened later, when I was running. What made them? He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. Garrett had a son. Twins, actually. They caught up with me about 2 miles from here. He touched his back gingerly, feeling the bandages through his shirt. They had knives. What happened to them? I killed them both. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Alina felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear, exactly. More like recognition. The understanding that she was sitting across from a man who'd killed 4 people in 3 days, and who spoke about it like it was just another problem he'd solved. Do you regret it? She asked. Killing Garrett? No. The others? He considered that. The bodyguard was trying to kill me. The twins were trying to avenge their father. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret surviving. That's a fine distinction. It's the only distinction that matters. Alina stood up and gathered the empty dishes. The conversation had gone on longer than she'd intended, and she could feel the weight of the day pressing down on her. There were chores to do, animals to feed, 100 small tasks that kept a house running. I'll bring you more food tonight, she said. Thank you. She climbed the stairs and locked the door behind her. In the kitchen, she washed the dishes and tried not to think about what she'd just learned. The man in her cellar wasn't just a fugitive. He was a killer, multiple times over, and she was hiding him from justice. But justice was a complicated word. Her father had taught her that. Some of the men he'd locked up had deserved worse than prison. Some had deserved better than the circumstances that brought them to his door. Alina looked out the window toward the road. No sign of the hunters returning, but that didn't mean anything. They could come back at any time, day or night, with warrants or without them. She thought about the key in her pocket, about the choice she'd made the night before, and all the choices that would follow from it, about the difference between what was right and what was smart. Outside, the wind was picking up again. It rattled the windows and made the house feel smaller than it was. The hunters came back twice more in the next 6 days, once in broad daylight with a different set of dogs, once just after midnight with torches and the kind of quiet that meant they expected to find something this time. Both searches turned up nothing but the same locked door, the same story about a lost key, the same nervous woman who answered their questions without quite meeting their eyes. Alina had gotten better at lying, not because she practiced, but because the truth had started to feel like something that happened to someone else. The man in her cellar was healing faster than she'd expected. By the 4th day, he could sit up without wincing. By the 6th, he was walking the length of the small space, testing his shoulder, flexing his back where the cuts had begun to close. She brought him clean clothes that had belonged to her father. They were too large through the chest, but close enough in length. On the 7th night, when she came down with his evening meal, he was standing by the far wall with his hands pressed against the bricks. Checking for weak spots, he said without turning around, in case I need another way out. Find any? The mortar's soft in 3 places, but it would take hours to dig through, and it would make noise. Alina set the tray on the wooden crate, soup made from vegetables, and the last of the preserved meat. bread that was only 1 day old, a cup of the weak tea she'd been drinking since her father's good leaves ran out. "The searches have stopped," she said. "For now. They think you're dead. Or long gone. Maybe." He turned around, and she saw that his face had changed over the past week. Not just the healing bruises, but something deeper. The wariness was still there, but underneath it was something harder, more settled, like he'd made a decision about something and was no longer interested in reconsidering it. "You're planning to leave. Tomorrow night, after the moon sets." Alina had known this moment would come, but hearing it said aloud made her stomach do something uncomfortable. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to disappointment. "Where will you go?" "North, past the territory lines. There are places up there where pack law doesn't reach. Wilderness." "Yes." She watched him eat the soup. He'd gotten his appetite back along with his strength, but he still ate carefully, like someone who'd learned that food was temporary and shouldn't be wasted. "What kind of life is that?" she asked. "The kind where I don't have to kill anyone for a while." The honesty in his voice made her look away. She'd been thinking of him as a killer for so long that she'd forgotten he might not want to be one. "Will you miss it? The pack life?" No. The answer came too quickly to be entirely true. Alina had lived alone since her father died. She knew the difference between choosing solitude and having it chosen for you. "What about family? Friends? Dead or smart enough to stay away from me?" He finished the soup and reached for the bread. "What about you? You'll go back to your quiet life, tend your garden, preserve your vegetables, pretend none of this ever happened." There was something in his tone that made the words sound like an accusation. "What else would I do?" "I don't know." He tore off a piece of bread and chewed it slowly. "But people don't usually risk their lives for strangers unless they're looking for something." "What makes you think I was looking for anything?" "Because you could have turned me away that first night, told me to find somewhere else to bleed. Instead, you brought me down here, cleaned my wounds, fed me for a week." He met her eyes. "That's not the behavior of someone who's content with their circumstances." Alina felt heat rise in her face. Not anger, but something more complicated. The discomfort of being seen too clearly by someone who had no right to look. "Maybe I just didn't want you dying in my yard." Maybe, but he didn't sound convinced. They finished the meal in silence. When he was done, Alina gathered the dishes and stood to leave. At the foot of the stairs, she turned back. "That first night," she said, "when you asked why I helped you, I said some doors are meant to be opened when no one's watching. I remember. I think I was wrong about that." "How so?" "I think someone's always watching. We just tell ourselves they're not because it makes the choice easier." He was quiet for a long moment. In the lantern light, his face looked older than it had when she'd first found him, more worn down. "Does that change anything?" he asked. "No," she said, "but it makes it honest." She climbed the stairs and locked the door behind her. In the kitchen, she washed the dishes and tried not to think about tomorrow night, about the empty cellar and the locked door with no one behind it, about going back to a life where the most dangerous thing that happened was running out of lamp oil. The next evening, she brought him supplies for the road: bread wrapped in cloth, dried meat, a water skin that had belonged to her father, a small knife with a bone handle. Not much, but enough to get him to wherever he was going. "Thank you," he said, packing everything into a canvas bag. "For all of it. Don't thank me yet. Wait until you're somewhere safe. There's no such place. Not for someone like me." He slung the bag over his good shoulder. "But there are places where the hunting is less organized." Alina followed him up the stairs. In the kitchen, she unlocked the back door and checked the yard. Clear moonlight. No movement except the apple tree swaying in the breeze. The road was empty in both directions. "The river crossing is 2 miles south," she said. "Follow the old logging trail until it splits, then take the left fork. It'll bring you to a shallow place where the water doesn't make much noise. You've thought this through. I've had time to think about a lot of things." He stepped onto the porch, then turned back to face her. For a moment, she thought he might say something else. Something about the week they'd shared, or the choice she'd made, or what it meant that their lives had crossed paths in her cellar. Instead, he touched 2 fingers to his forehead, in a gesture that might have been a salute, or a goodbye. Then he walked across the yard and disappeared into the trees. Alina stood in the doorway until the sound of his footsteps faded. Then she went back inside, locked the door, and cleaned the bloodstains out of the cellar. 3 weeks later, word came that Alpha Garrett's territory had a new leader. Not one of the established pack members as everyone had expected. but the fugitive they'd all been hunting. Thale, the man who'd poisoned the old Alpha and killed his sons, had returned with enough support to claim the mantle by right of succession. The news came from a traveling merchant who dealt in information as much as goods. He told the story like it was entertainment, embellishing the details for dramatic effect. How Rovan had appeared at the Pack's central lodge during a leadership challenge. How he'd faced down 3 contenders in single combat. How he'd claimed the Alpha's mantle not through inheritance, but through the older law that said leadership belonged to whoever was strong enough to take it, and smart enough to keep it. Quite a turnaround, the merchant said, helping himself to tea in Alina's kitchen. From hunted fugitive to pack leader in less than a month. Makes you wonder what he learned out there in the wilderness. Alina poured him another cup and said nothing. She'd gotten better at saying nothing over the past few weeks. They say he's different from the old Alpha, the merchant continued. Quieter, more careful about picking his battles, but just as ruthless when he needs to be. Ruthless how? Well, first thing he did was execute the hunters who'd been chasing him. Said they'd been too loyal to the old regime to be trusted with the new one. The merchant leaned forward conspiratorially. But here's the interesting part. He didn't kill them all at once. In public. Like most new Alphas would. Did it one at a time in private. Made it look like natural deaths or hunting accidents. Alina's hand stilled on her teacup. All of them? Every last one. Took him 2 weeks to work through the whole pack. Very methodical. Very patient. The merchant finished his tea and stood to leave. Course. Could be just rumors. But the roads are a lot quieter than they used to be. Whatever he's doing, it's working. After the merchant left, Alina sat alone in her kitchen and thought about methodical patience. About the difference between killing in passion and killing in calculation. About what a man might learn in the wilderness that he couldn't learn anywhere else. She thought about Keston, the hunter with the scarred hands who'd led the search of her house. About the young hunter who'd been nervous around horses. About the black and tan hound who'd known someone had been hiding behind her cellar door. All dead now, if the merchant was telling the truth. Alina tried to feel sorry for them. They'd been doing their jobs, following orders, hunting a fugitive who'd committed murder. But when she closed her eyes, all she could see was Keston spitting in her yard and talking about breaking down doors. The young hunter fingering his weapon while he asked questions. The way they'd walked through her house like they owned it. She didn't feel sorry. She felt something closer to relief, and that realization bothered her more than the deaths themselves. Rovan returned to her house on a Tuesday evening in late spring, 6 months after she'd last seen him disappear into the trees behind her yard. She was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard a horse approaching on the road. Multiple horses, actually. The sound of iron shoes on packed earth, leather creaking, men talking in low voices. She stood up slowly, brushing dirt off her hands. Through the fence, she could see riders in the distance. 5 of them, moving at an unhurried pace. Not the frantic energy of hunters in pursuit, but the measured approach of men who knew their destination and weren't worried about what they'd find when they got there. The lead rider separated from the group as they reached her gate. Even at a distance, even dressed in clothes she'd never seen him wear, she recognized him immediately. The way he sat his horse, the angle of his shoulders, the deliberate economy of his movements. He was wearing black now. Not the rough traveling clothes he'd left in, but well-cut fabric that looked expensive. A cloak that moved with his horse's gait. Boots that had been polished recently. The clothes of someone who had to look the part of authority. Around his shoulders was something that might have been fur, or might have been something else entirely. It caught the late sunlight and seemed to absorb it rather than reflect it. The Alpha's mantle. She'd heard descriptions, but had never seen one up close. Rovan dismounted at her gate and tied his horse to the fence post. His men stayed mounted, positioned at intervals along the road where they could see in all directions. Not threatening, exactly, but present in a way that made it clear this wasn't a social visit. Alina wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the house. She didn't hurry, didn't run to greet him or hang back in fear, just walked at the pace she always walked, as if armed men arrived at her gate every day. He met her at the front door. Up close, she could see that 6 months of leadership had changed him. He was heavier through the shoulders, broader across the chest. His face had filled out. Lost the gaunt look of someone who'd been running on too little food and too much adrenaline. His hair was shorter, neater. His beard was trimmed close, but his eyes were the same, gray or pale blue. Hard to tell in the dying light. Alina. Alpha. She wasn't sure if that was the right form of address. but it seemed safer than using his name. "May I come in?" It was phrased as a request, but they both knew it wasn't really a question. Alina stepped aside and let him enter her kitchen. He looked around the room like he was cataloging changes. The new curtains she'd sewn from fabric the traveling merchant had sold her. The shelf her father had never finished, which she'd finally completed herself. The table where she'd sat that first night, breaking bread into pieces and listening to dogs bay in the distance. "You've been well?" he asked. "Well enough. No more midnight visitors? No more hunters at your door?" "No." He nodded, like that confirmed something he'd already expected. "Good. That's good." They stood in her kitchen looking at each other. Alina found herself remembering the last time they'd been in this room together, when he'd been wounded and desperate, and she'd been naive enough to think hiding someone was a temporary problem with a simple solution. "Why are you here?" she asked. "To make sure you understand how things work now." "What things?" "Territory, boundaries, protection." He moved to the window and looked out toward the road where his men were waiting. "This land is part of my domain now. That makes you one of my people. That comes with benefits and obligations." "What kind of obligations?" "Loyalty, discretion, the usual things." Alina felt something cold settle in her stomach. "And if I don't want to be one of your people, then you're free to leave. Tonight, if you prefer. My men will escort you to the territory line and make sure you get wherever you're going safely." The offer sounded reasonable, even generous, but the way he said it made it clear that leaving was the only alternative to staying under his protection. There was no third option where she remained neutral. "This is my home," she said. "Yes, and now it's under my protection." "I don't remember asking for protection." "You didn't have to ask." He turned away from the window to face her directly. "You earned it." The word earned hung in the air between them like smoke. Alina understood what he was saying without him having to spell it out. She'd hidden him when he was hunted, fed him when he was wounded, kept his secrets when men with dogs came looking for answers. Now that he had the power to repay debts, he was offering to repay this one. But debts worked both ways, and men in positions of power didn't usually repay favors without expecting something in return. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "Nothing. Nobody offers protection for nothing." "I do." There was something in his voice that made her look at him more carefully. Not quite vulnerability, but something close to it. A crack in the authority he wore like armor. "Why?" He was quiet for a long time. Outside, one of his horses nickered softly. A night bird called from somewhere in the apple tree. Normal sounds that made the silence between them feel heavier than it should have. "Because some debts can't be paid," he said finally. "Only acknowledged." Alina thought about that. About the week she'd spent bringing food to her cellar, cleaning wounds, lying to hunters. About the choice she'd made to open her door instead of keeping it closed. About the man who'd left her kitchen as a fugitive and returned as an alpha. "The hunters who came here," she said. "The ones who searched my house. Are they dead?" "Yes." "All of them?" "Yes." "Because of what happened here? Because they came too close to finding you?" "Among other reasons." The honesty was unsettling. Not because he'd killed them, but because he spoke about it like it was just another administrative decision. The kind of thing that had to be done to keep order. "Do you regret it?" "Regret is a luxury I can't afford anymore." "That's not an answer." "It's the only answer that matters." Alina walked to the stove and put the kettle on to boil. Tea seemed like the right thing to offer, even though she wasn't sure this conversation called for hospitality. Her hands were steady as she measured leaves into the pot, but she could feel him watching her every movement. "How long will your protection last?" she asked. "As long as I'm alpha. And if something happens to you, then you'll deal with my successor. But I don't plan on dying anytime soon." The kettle whistled. Alina poured water over the tea leaves. The smell filled the kitchen, familiar and comforting, in a way that made the presence of armed men outside seem surreal. "Will you stay for tea?" "No. I have other business tonight." He walked toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the latch. For a moment, she thought he might say something else. Something about the week they'd shared, or the choice she'd made, or what it had cost them both. Instead, he opened the door and stepped onto the porch. "Sleep well, Alina," he said without turning around. "You're safe here." She watched through the window as he mounted his horse and signaled to his men. They rode away at the same unhurried pace they'd arrived, disappearing into the darkness beyond her gate. Alina poured herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table. The house felt different now, not smaller or larger, but changed in some fundamental way. Like the walls had been marked with something invisible that would never wash off. She thought about protection and obligations, about debts that couldn't be paid, only acknowledged, about the difference between being safe and being free. Outside, the night was quiet. No dogs baying in the distance, no torches moving along the road. Just the normal sounds of a world where she was no longer invisible, where her choices had consequences that rippled outward in ways she was only beginning to understand. The tea grew cold while she sat there. When she finally got up to go to bed, she left the cup on the table, a small act of defiance that no one would ever see. In the morning, she would clean it up and go about her daily business, tend her garden, preserve her vegetables, live the quiet life she'd always lived. But she would do it all under the protection of an alpha who owed her a debt he couldn't repay, in a house that was no longer truly her own, on land that belonged to a man she'd once hidden in her cellar. Upstairs, she lay in bed and listened to the house settle around her. Sometimes she thought she could hear sounds from below. Footsteps, maybe, or someone shifting position. But the cellar was empty now, and the walls were thick, and she couldn't be sure. She closed her eyes and tried not to think about what morning would bring. 18 months later, Alina was scraping ice off the pump handle when she heard the courier's horse on the road. The metal was slick under her fingers. She had to grip it with both hands to get the lever moving. Water came out in spurts, then a steady stream that steamed in the cold air. The courier didn't dismount, just handed her a sealed letter and waited while she dried her hands on her apron to take it. The wax was black with a pressed seal she didn't recognize, heavy paper that felt expensive between her fingers. "Reply expected?" the courier asked. "I don't know what it says yet." He shrugged and rode off without waiting for her to open it. Inside, Alina set the letter on the kitchen table next to a bowl of apples she'd been meaning to core for 3 days. The seal cracked when she worked her fingernail under it. The paper inside was folded once, writing in careful script that took up less space than seemed necessary. AK. Border dispute with Eastern Territory requires settlement. Your knowledge of the old survey markers would be useful. Compensation standard. Send word by return courier if agreeable. RT. She read it twice, then folded it and put it back on the table. Through the window she could see where the old property line used to run, marked by stones her father had set when she was young. Most people had forgotten those markers existed, but Alina had walked the boundaries with him every spring, learning which stones were original and which had been moved by neighbors trying to gain a few extra yards. Standard compensation. She wondered what that meant to an alpha. Probably more than she'd seen in a year, maybe 2. She put the letter in the drawer with the other 3 he'd sent over the past months. Questions about water rights, about which families had lived where before the territory changed hands, about old grudges that might complicate new alliances. Always brief, always practical, always signed with his initials instead of his name. The first time, she'd written back immediately. A detailed response with everything she remembered about the families who used to live near the river crossing. The second time, she'd waited a week before answering, testing whether urgency was real or assumed. The third time, she'd sent back 2 words. Information incomplete. That had brought him to her door in person, which might have been what she'd wanted. Hard to tell, even to herself. He'd stood in her kitchen drinking coffee that was too strong and asking follow-up questions about families that had moved away before she was born. But he'd also eaten 3 of the biscuits she'd made that morning and complimented the jam, and mentioned that the new curtains made the room look brighter. Small talk, like they were neighbors instead of whatever they actually were. Alina put another log in the stove and adjusted the damper. The letter could wait until evening, or tomorrow. Time worked differently when people needed things from you instead of the other way around. She spent the afternoon mending a torn seam in her winter coat. The fabric was wearing thin, but it would last another season if she was careful. Outside, snow started falling around midday, the kind of fine powder that would accumulate slowly and last for weeks. By evening, she'd decided to accept the commission. Not because she needed the money, though she did, and not because she felt obligated to help, though that was part of it. Mostly because she was curious about what a border dispute looked like from the inside. Her father had always dealt with the aftermath of such things, never the negotiations themselves. She wrote her acceptance on the back of a seed catalog page. Agreeable. When and where. AK. No signature flourish, no unnecessary politeness. She was learning to match his economy of language. The courier returned 2 days later with another sealed letter. This one contained a hand-drawn map with a route marked in red ink. Instructions to meet at a crossroads inn that was half a day's ride north, 3 days hence. Room and board provided. Also tucked into the letter was a small leather pouch that clinked when she shook it. She counted the coins twice. More than standard compensation. More than generous. The kind of payment that suggested either he valued her knowledge highly, or he was paying for something beyond information. Trust, maybe. Or silence. Or the peculiar loyalty that came from shared secrets. Alina packed light for the journey. An extra dress, clean undergarments, the leather journal where she kept notes about property boundaries and family histories, her father's compass, which still pointed north despite being dropped more times than she could count. She locked the house and rode north on her father's old horse, following roads she'd traveled as a child. The inn was where the map said it would be, a 2-story building with smoke coming from 3 chimneys, enough horses in the stable to suggest good business. Rovan was waiting in the common room, sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall. He was dressed simply, like any other traveler, but the innkeeper treated him with the careful deference reserved for men who could cause problems if displeased. "You came," he said, when she approached the table. "Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might change your mind. I considered it." He gestured to the empty chair across from him. On the table were 2 cups of ale, a plate of bread and cheese, and the kind of detailed map that cost real money to commission. Property lines drawn in different colored inks, names written in neat script beside houses and barns and wells. "The Eastern Pack claims the boundary runs along the old creek bed," he said without preamble. "But the creek moved after the flooding 2 winters ago. Now it's 50 yards west of where it used to be." Alina studied the map while she ate. The disputed area was prime hunting ground. Thick forest with good water access. Worth fighting over if someone was inclined to fight. What do the original survey markers say? That's the problem. Half of them are missing. The others have been moved so many times that no one knows where they were supposed to be. Except me. Except you. She traced the boundary line with her finger. Her father had walked this territory when he was young, before he became a jailer. He'd told her stories about the families who used to live here, about feuds that went back generations, about stones that had been set and reset and set again as power shifted between different packs. "I can find the original markers," she said, "but it'll take time. Some of them are buried under years of leaf litter. Others might have been broken up for building stone. How much time? A week, maybe 2. Rovan nodded and drank his ale. Around them, the inn buzzed with the conversation of travelers and local farmers. Normal people talking about weather and crops and the price of grain. No one paid attention to the quiet discussion at the corner table about boundaries and territories, about the old laws that governed who could claim what. "There's something else," he said. "What?" "The Eastern Alpha wants to settle this through single combat. Winner takes the disputed territory." Alina set down her ale. "And you're considering it?" "I'm obligated to consider it. It's a legitimate challenge under pack law." "Is he stronger than you?" "Probably. Younger, definitely. Been training for this his whole life." "Then why would you accept?" "Because if I don't, it makes me look weak, and weak alphas don't last long." The logic was brutal, but sound. Alina had seen enough of pack politics through her father's work to understand how these things worked. Strength was currency. Hesitation was debt. And debt accumulated interest until it became unbearable. What if the survey proves the boundary is where you say it is? Then he'll have to find another excuse to challenge me. But at least I'll have bought time to prepare. And if the survey proves he's right, then I'll fight him for land that's rightfully his. And probably lose. Rovan smiled, but there was no humor in it. Either way, knowing the truth is better than guessing. They finished their meal in silence. When the innkeeper brought the bill, Rovan paid with coins that bore the same seal as his letters. New currency, minted with his authority. The kind of detail that separated real alphas from temporary ones. "Your room is upstairs," he said as they stood to leave. "Third door on the right. We'll start surveying at dawn. Where will you sleep?" "I won't." He gathered the maps and rolled them carefully. "Too many people here I don't know. Too many windows and doors." Alina understood. Power made you a target. And targets didn't survive by sleeping soundly in unfamiliar places. She wondered when he'd last spent a full night unconscious. When he'd last trusted his surroundings enough to close his eyes without one hand on a weapon. "The cellar door," she said suddenly. "What about it? That first night?" when I locked you in. You could have broken it down from the inside. The hinges were old, the wood was soft. You were hurt, but you weren't helpless." "No," he agreed. "I wasn't. But you didn't try." "No." "Why?" He looked at her for a long moment, like he was deciding whether the answer was worth the risk of saying it out loud. "Because breaking down doors is what desperate men do," he said finally. "And I'd been desperate for long enough." He left her standing in the common room, holding that answer like something fragile that might break if she examined it too closely. Upstairs, she lay in the narrow inn bed and listened to the sounds of other travelers settling in for the night. Footsteps in the hallway, muffled conversations through thin walls. Somewhere below, the creak of floorboards as someone moved around the common room. She thought about desperation and the things people did when they ran out of other options, about the difference between accepting help and demanding it, about the choice he'd made to trust a locked door instead of breaking it down. Outside her window, snow continued to fall, not the fine powder from earlier, but heavy flakes that stuck to the glass and muffled the sounds from the stable, the kind of snow that would make travel difficult and surveying work miserable. But they would do it anyway. Walk the boundaries, find the markers, measure the distances that determined who owned what and who had the right to fight for it. Map the territory not as it was, but as it was supposed to be according to laws set by men who were long dead. Alina pulled the blankets up to her chin and tried not to think about what would happen if the survey proved the Eastern Alpha was right. About single combat and the kind of strength that came from youth instead of experience. About the difference between being protected by someone and being responsible for protecting them. The snow kept falling. Somewhere in the building, a door opened and closed quietly, normal sounds that meant nothing and everything, depending on how carefully you listened. She closed her eyes and tried not to listen too carefully. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.